Would you pray with me and for me, please? Gracious God, may the meditations of our hearts and the words of my mouth be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, you who are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Oh, I forgot Carl. If you were here last week, you met my buddy Carl. This is Carl from the Disney Pixar movie Up. It's a fan favorite for a lot of Disney folks that like to watch Disney cartoons and movies. This was actually painted by a friend of mine, Danny Ulrich, and it's a beautiful piece, and it's online from a museum on Woodside Street, where a lot of his stuff hangs in his family's house. And I love Danny's work. I love to watch him get excited about his painting. And this is something he did quite a number of years ago. And I asked if I could borrow it. And there's a couple of other pieces you're going to be seeing later in this series as we approach Easter. But this is Carl. We talked about Carl last week. So if you weren't here and you don't know the movie Up, let me tell you a little bit about Carl. Carl is an old curmudgeon, and the city's growing up around him, and he's frustrated and he's angry because life has changed and the world has moved on, and he never got to fulfill his dream of going with his beautiful bride to the falls. Something came up, something came up, something came up, something came up, something came up. And they did what happens in life for so many of us. You keep postponing your dreams, you keep postponing your vision, you keep postponing those things that are not absolutely necessary for you to do, but other things got in the way, and it's just a thing called life. Just gets in the way. So the city has grown up around him, the neighborhood is gone, he's living by himself, and finally, he pulls the lever. And the lever results in a gazillion, actually it's a gazillion point two balloons that pop out from underneath his house, helium balloons, lift his house up off the foundation, and he begins to head toward the falls. There's a lot of adventures along the way, and if you haven't rewatched the movie, it's on Disney Plus and in other places, and I think I might have a VHS cassette of it for any of you who might know what that is. And somewhere I might even have a piece of equipment that plays it. I know we probably have a stack of them here at the church, because churches are notorious for gaining that equipment and it never leaving. But Carl takes off. And in the process of Carl's adventures, at certain points in the process, in order to accomplish what he's trying to do, in order to get to where he needs to go, in order to do all of the things that he has to do, he has to jettison ballast. Now, that term may not be a particularly familiar term to you, to jettison some ballast. But it's a vital term in the navigation at sea. It's a vital term in navigation in the air. And it's a term that comes to us originally from the seafaring men and women, both in and around the Sea of Galilee, but also on the Mediterranean and anywhere where there's water and fish. Because at some point, our great ancestors discovered how good them their fishies are. Now, you may not be a fishy person, but you might be a scrimp person or an oyster person or a trout person or a catfish person. Catfish nuggets and trout cheek. Grouper cheek. Good eats. I'm a shrimp guy myself. Love the shellfish. But once we discovered what was in there and that they were very tasty when properly prepared, we've been going looking for them. But you can't catch all of them by the edge of the stream. You can't catch all of them by standing in the sand or on the banks, or even by taking your nets out into the water chest high and scooping them out. To get some of the good stuff, you've got to go out deep to get some of the good stuff, right? And so, especially if you like things like tuna, if you like swordfish, if you like that kind of stuff, you got to go out deep. And so we began to figure out how to get out there, wherever out there was. If it's the Sea of Galilee, or if it's the Mediterranean Ocean, or if it's the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, people began the quest of going out and trying to figure out, how do I get what's out there? And they ran into trouble. Because, most of what we invent because we ran into trouble. And any of you who have spent any time on a boat in rough seas or windy seas, you know what I'm talking about. You folks who live out there on the Lake James, there are some days that you are just chomping at the bit to fire up that hole in the water into which you pour your money, your boat, and get out there on that beautiful, glassy, crystal, flat, perfect, sunshiny day. Some of you are going to walk out of here, even though it's cold for some. Some of you are going to walk out of here after this sermon and think, that's it. I'm going to go put the boat in the water. It's just time. But then there are other days when you're sitting in the house and you're glad that you can look out at the water because you can see whitecaps on the lake. My uncle used to live on Lake Norman on the north end of the lake, and it was not uncommon in the area where he lived for the wind to come up out of the southwest and there to be whitecaps out in front of his house. By the way, it really didn't matter to him. We went anyway. But what people discovered was if your boat rides too high in the water and it's very windy and it's very rough, you're in trouble because you are subject to the movement of the waves and the movement of the wind, right? And so sailors began to learn of the notion of ballast. If you go to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, if you go to the bottom of the Mediterranean Ocean, you're going to find stuff that doesn't belong there. It's going to come in the form of rocks and clay vases. Because that was the ballast. To keep the ship riding low in the water until the ship could take on cargo, people, or fish, or all three. That would make for smooth sailing. Now, let's move forward several thousand years to the invention of the hot air balloon. And those that fly hot air balloons learned the same thing. That even though there was no water underneath them, there was air moving around them, and without sufficient ballast in the basket that you were in, you became a swing in the air with minimal control. And so you needed to have ballast in order to maintain a course. Now, too much ballast in the boat, what happens? You're going to take on water. Too much ballast in the balloon, you're not going to get off the ground. So there's a balance that is required. There's a balance that is necessary in order to accomplish flight and in order to accomplish movement on the water. And guess what? there's a balance that is required for you and I to function as human beings. For the last 25 years of my life, I have done something called Critical Incident Stress Management, CISM. I do that primarily with responders. I also do that with medical personnel. I do that with people who have been at the scene of tragic accidents and witnessed horrific things and need to find some way to process that. And as a part of learning about CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, we learned about it first with our warriors. We learned about it first with those who have been on the front lines. And we've learned a lot from them over the last several hundred years about post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a whole science around it. And initially, when we see a problem, we want to fix the problem, right? And if somebody's got too much stress on them, what we want to do is help them remove all their stress. And guess what? We found out that that was bad. You wouldn't think it was bad to take away everybody's stress or all the stress that somebody had, but it's bad because what people who know more stuff than I know tell me, and I believe them, there are two kinds of stress. There is distress and there is eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. Distress, eustress. Now, I don't know if back 20 years ago when they did those little tests, that you ever did those little tests where you got points for all of these stressors in your life. And this is when that part of the science was first coming about, and you got so many points for certain things happening. Like somebody dies, that's a lot of points. But you know what is also the same amount of points? When a baby gets born. All right, so a baby being born, distress or eustress? Eustress. I got one coming in my family, not Holly and I, but I've got one coming in my family. Oh, I'm discombobulated here, aren't I? I've got one coming in my family on April 1st. No fooling. And that's eustress. There's excitement, there's anticipation, and I had no idea that you had to have that much stuff to have a baby these days. Because apparently you got to have way more stuff than what I had when we had ours. And so you got to have a lot of showers and to get a lot of stuff. Eustress. It's good stress. My daughter-in-law has that thing where the placenta's not right. Placenta previa. Is that eustress or distress? That's distress. That's distress. So one event can hold both kinds of stress. Jesus is winding things to a point where he's got to tell the disciples what's ahead. And what's ahead is their suffering. What's ahead is their pain. What's ahead is his suffering. What's ahead is his pain. What is ahead is his death. And so Peter pulls him aside and says, Jesus, please don't talk like this. I really don't want you talking like this, because if you talk like this, you're going to distress the disciples. You're going to disrupt the movement. Things aren't going to go like you would like for them to go. So please don't talk about yourself. They're on the crest of a wave at this point. The disciples are riding a crest of the wave in Jesus' ministry. Things are as good as they have ever been. And now Jesus is talking about leaving them, and Jesus is talking about his suffering, and Jesus is talking about his death, and Jesus is talking about their suffering and possibly their death. Peter doesn't want to hear this. Because having a whole bunch of people follow you and having to feed them breads and fishes, eustress or distress? It's a little bit of both, isn't it? I mean, what a great problem to have, so many people. Like, hopefully, we'll have a great problem right after church, and Abby will have to multiply garlic bread and biscotti. But then where's the food going to come from? How are we going to do that? Is there going to be enough to feed anybody in distress? Well, they're at the high point of the wave. They're having great problems to have to solve. Peter didn't want to hear this nonsense about difficulty and suffering and challenge. And Jesus pulls him aside and gives him a talking to. And his favorite disciple, he looks at him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." That's pretty hardcore right there, don't you think? I mean, one minute we're saying your name is Petros, Peter, and you're the rock upon which I'm going to build my church. And now Jesus is saying, "Get behind me, Satan." It's part of that balance, I guess. And Jesus begins to explain that this is how it is, and that this is how it works. I love the our litany hymn that we're using during Lent about us bringing even our dust to Jesus. And in this moment, Peter is bringing his dust. Peter is bringing his fear. Peter is bringing his worry. Peter is bringing his anxiety. Peter is bringing his grief to Jesus to present it to him. Even our dust becomes a gift. Even our brokenness can become an offering. If we find ourselves with too much ballast or not enough. So as the boat takes on water, people, fish, cargo, as the balloon begins to rise on a beautiful, clear, still day, the captain of either ship finds that they've got to release some ballast. So not sure where you sit today, where you are, what's going on in your mind or your heart, but I want you to know you don't have to carry all of this ballast with you. It's all right to jerk a rope and release a bag and get rid of a rock, or dump out some sand, some dust, so that you can ride a little higher in the water, so that you can float a little higher into the atmosphere. But it's also all right to do the opposite. If you feel that you need a little more ballast in order to acquire a little more stability in your life because things are swaying way out of control, or you're riding too high on the waves and you're being buffeted about by the wind, or you're being driven by the waves from one place to another, it is okay for you to take on more ballast and to find that sweet spot between eustress and distress. God's created those things for you so that you have a means to create and maintain your stability. But you got to identify what it is that you need and how that's going to work for you. You got to know. You've got to understand. You've got to clearly assess, because you're the captain of your ship. And hear me when I say this. You are the captain of your ship. Uh-oh. Here it comes a third time. You or the captain of your ship. And you alone bear responsibility for what you need to get rid of and for what you need to take on. And it's nobody else's business to explain that to you. That's a gig between you and Jesus. That's it. Nobody else walks in your shoes. Nobody else wears your clothes. Nobody else lives your life. Well, they might wear your clothes. That's another problem. You come by, we'll talk about that. Nobody else gets to judge where you are and where you need to head, because that's a gig between you and God, right? But I'll tell you, just look around this room right here. You've got a whole lot of people that'll listen to you and help you process that. Be in your corner and support you as you take your steps toward the life that God intends for you. Might not be the life someone else intends for you, but it is the way that God intends for your life to be, and you alone in that relationship are the one to receive that information, to act on that information, to live out that information. In the name of God who was, and God who is, and God who is yet to